There's something uniquely unsettling about being far from home, in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by silence. It's in those moments, alone in a cabin, a motel, or even a cozy Airbnb, that the imagination starts to wander. Every creak in the floorboards, every shadow outside the window feels like a threat. But what if those feelings aren't just in your head? The stories you're about to hear are not urban legends or campfire tales. These are real accounts of people who sought refuge in quiet getaways, only to encounter something, or someone, they couldn't explain. Lock your doors, check your windows, and settle in. Because sometimes, isolation isn't as peaceful as it seems. First story, The Shadow in the Woods. It was late October, and my friends and I had decided to rent a remote cabin for the weekend. The plan was simple, a few days of hiking, bonfires, and disconnecting from the world. The cabin was located deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town, and it looked perfect in the photos, rustic but cozy, with a fire pit and a great view of the surrounding trees. When we arrived, the first thing we noticed was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet, it was the unnerving, heavy kind. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness that seemed to press in on all sides. The cabin itself was exactly as advertised. Inside, it had a warm, lived-in feel, with old furniture and a wood-burning stove. But there was something odd. Every window had thick, heavy curtains that didn't quite match the rest of the decor. They looked like they were designed to block out every bit of light, or maybe, to keep something from looking in. We brushed it off and spent the first evening laughing around the fire pit, roasting marshmallows, and telling stories. By the time we went to bed, we were exhausted, and I fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a faint tapping sound. It was so light that I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. I stayed still, listening. The tapping came again, a little louder this time. It was coming from the window near my bed. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside, but all I saw was darkness. The forest was pitch black, and my reflection stared back at me in the glass. Convinced it was just a tree branch, I went back to bed. The next morning, I mentioned it to my friends. One of them, Dave, said he'd heard footsteps outside his window around the same time. But when he looked, there was no one there. We joked about it, blaming animals or the wind, but there was a tension in the air we couldn't shake. That night, we all decided to keep the curtains open. It felt silly, but we wanted to prove to ourselves there was nothing out there. As the hours passed, the tension melted away, and we fell asleep one by one. I woke up again around 2 a.m. This time, it wasn't tapping that woke me, it was the feeling of being watched. I opened my eyes and saw a shadow move across the window. At first, I thought it was just the branches swaying in the wind, but then I noticed something chilling. The shadow was tall, much taller than any of us, and it wasn't moving like a branch. It was deliberate, slow, as if it was pacing back and forth. I whispered to Dave, who was in the bed across from me, but he was sound asleep. My heart was pounding as I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. I shone it toward the window, and for a split second, I saw it. A face. It was pale and expressionless, pressed right up against the glass. The eyes were wide, unblinking, and empty, as if they weren't looking at me but through me. I screamed, and the face vanished. The others woke up in a panic as I told them what I'd seen. Dave and another friend grabbed flashlights and went outside to check, but they didn't find anything, no footprints, no signs of anyone being there. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, we packed our things and left. The strangest part? When we got home, I checked the photos I'd taken during the trip. In one of them, a group shot of us sitting around the fire. There was something in the background. A tall, shadowy figure, standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. Second story, The Stranger at the Campfire. A few years ago, my boyfriend and I decided to spend New Year's Eve in a cabin deep in the woods. We both loved the outdoors and thought it would be a nice escape from the usual city chaos. The cabin we rented was charming but isolated, no neighbors, no cell service, just us and the wilderness. We arrived in the afternoon and spent the first day exploring the surrounding forest. As the sun set, we built a fire outside, roasted some food, and enjoyed the peaceful atmosphere. The quiet was almost therapeutic, but as the night wore on, it started to feel oppressive, like the forest was listening. Around 10 p.m., we decided to call it a night. The temperature had dropped significantly, and we wanted to warm up inside. I doused the fire, and we locked the cabin door before heading to bed. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to the sound of crackling. At first, I thought it was just the wood stove burning out, but then I realized it was coming from outside. I got up, walked to the window, and peeked out. The fire pit was blazing. My stomach dropped. I had put the fire out hours ago, and there was no way it could have reignited on its own. I shook my boyfriend awake, whispering frantically about what I'd seen. He got up, grabbed a flashlight, and cautiously opened the door. As soon as the door creaked, the fire went out. Completely. The pit was still smoking, but the flames were gone, like someone had dumped water on it. My boyfriend shone the flashlight around, but there was nothing, no movement, no footprints in the snow, just an eerie, suffocating silence. We locked the door and spent the rest of the night in the living room, too scared to go back to sleep. The next morning, we decided to leave early. As we were packing up, I noticed something strange about the fire pit. Around its edges, there were deep indentations in the snow, almost like someone had been kneeling there. But the strangest part? On one of the cabin's windows, there was a clear handprint. It wasn't ours. It was far too large, and the fingers were unnaturally long. We left without looking back, and to this day, neither of us can explain what happened that night. Third story, the cabin with the locked room. Last winter, my two closest friends and I rented a cabin deep in the mountains for a weekend getaway. It was one of those online listings that seemed too good to be true, a rustic yet modern cabin with amazing views, plenty of space, and complete solitude. We didn't think twice before booking it. When we arrived, everything looked just as advertised, except for one odd detail. There was a locked door in the hallway. It had a large padlock on it and no mention of it in the listing. At first, we thought it might be a supply closet or storage, so we shrugged it off and focused on enjoying our trip. That first evening, we cooked dinner, played cards, and stayed up late talking by the fireplace. By midnight, we were all exhausted and decided to call it a night. My friends took the upstairs bedroom, and I stayed in the room downstairs, just across from the locked door. I fell asleep quickly but woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange noise. It was faint at first, like soft footsteps on the wooden floor, but as I lay there, frozen in bed, I realized they were coming from the hallway. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, but when I opened the door, there was nothing. Just the empty hallway and the locked door, looming in the shadows. I convinced myself I was imagining things and went back to bed. The next morning, I mentioned it to my friends, but they brushed it off, saying the cabin was probably just settling in the cold. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The second night was when things got worse. We had just gone to bed when I heard it again, footsteps, this time louder. They started in the hallway and stopped right outside my door. I texted my friends upstairs, telling them what I was hearing. A moment later, I got a reply, "We hear it too. It's outside our door now." My heart was pounding as I listened to the sound of something moving slowly through the cabin. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud bang, like something heavy had fallen. I grabbed a flashlight and opened my door, ready to face whatever it was. The hallway was empty, but the locked door was slightly ajar. The padlock dangled from the latch, unlocked. I froze, staring at the dark gap of the door. I wanted to run, but my friends came rushing down the stairs, shining their phone flashlights everywhere. Together, we opened the door all the way. Inside was an empty, unfinished room with nothing but a single chair in the center. The walls were bare wood, and there were no windows, no furniture, nothing except a faint smell of dampness. Then we saw it. Scratched into the wall above the chair were the words, "I'm watching you." We didn't stay long enough to figure out what it meant. We packed up immediately and left the cabin before sunrise. The owner later claimed the door was never supposed to be unlocked and that no one had been there before us. But to this day, none of us can explain the noises, the unlocked door, or the message in that room. Fourth story, the stranger in the snow. Last Christmas, my girlfriend and I decided to spend the holiday at a remote mountain cabin. It was a charming place, surrounded by dense forest, with a perfect view of the snow-covered peaks. The road to the cabin was treacherous, winding through narrow passes, but it was worth it once we arrived. The isolation was exactly what we wanted, a peaceful escape from the stress of the holidays. The first 2 days were uneventful. We spent our time cooking, playing board games, and sitting by the fire. The only downside was that the cabin had no internet or cell service, but that was part of the appeal. On the third night, just as we were about to go to bed, we heard a faint knock at the front door. It was so soft that at first, I thought I imagined it, but then it came again. We exchanged nervous glances. No one should have been able to find this place unless they were specifically looking for it. I opened the door cautiously, but no one was there, just the cold wind and the snow. I stepped outside and looked around. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were fresh, leading up to our door and then back toward the tree line. The unsettling part was that they didn't follow a straight path, they zigzagged, almost like whoever made them had been wandering aimlessly. I called out into the darkness, but there was no response. My girlfriend pulled me back inside, and we locked the door, trying to convince ourselves it was just a hiker who had gotten lost. But the next morning, things got stranger. We woke up to find new footprints circling the cabin. They were everywhere, around the fire pit, near the windows, even leading up to the back door. It was as if someone had spent the entire night walking around the property. I decided to check the woods. Armed with a flashlight and a knife from the kitchen, I followed the trail of footprints. They led deeper into the trees and eventually stopped abruptly, as if the person had simply vanished. That night, we didn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin made us jump, and we kept the lights on, waiting for something to happen. Around 2 a.m., we heard it again, a knock, but this time it was louder, more insistent. I grabbed the knife and shouted through the door, demanding to know who was there. No answer. The knocking continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Finally, I yanked the door open. Again, there was no one, but this time, there was something on the ground, a small, folded piece of paper. I picked it up with trembling hands and unfolded it. Written in shaky, uneven letters were the words, "You can't hide forever." We packed up and left before the sun rose, driving through the snow-covered roads as fast as we could. To this day, we have no idea who was out there or why they were watching us. As these stories remind us, the unknown can be closer than we think, lurking just outside the safety of our walls, or sometimes, already inside. The idea of being watched, followed, or targeted when we're at our most vulnerable taps into a fear we all share. If there's one thing to take away from these accounts, it's this: trust your instincts. Pay attention to the little details that don't feel right. Because in those quiet moments, when isolation turns into dread, it's often better to be cautious than to regret not taking action. Stay safe out there. And remember, sometimes, the scariest things aren't the ones we imagine, they're the ones we never saw coming.